So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on enhancing economic resilience to global shocks through business environment reforms. My name is Tobias Leek. I work as an advisor for GSZ, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development. If you're not familiar with the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, let me say some words about it. The DCED is an international forum for donor organizations supporting private sector development in developing countries. It promotes knowledge sharing, the development of result measurement standards, and the support of market and enterprise development. So before we start, I would like to point out some housekeeping rules. So first of all, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and it will be made public available afterwards. So if you stay in this call, at least your name or your video will be recorded. The other thing is, if you have any questions or comments during our presentation or also afterwards, please use the question and answer box which is available. And in the question and answer session, we will try to address as many questions as possible which are posted in the box. So now back to today's topic, which is enhancing economic resilience to global shocks. So this is a very important topic because low and middle income countries are increasingly exposed to global shocks like pandemics, financial crisis, and climate change. Often micro, small, and medium enterprises are the most affected of these shocks. So in today's presentation, we will hear how low and middle income countries can build resilience and improve their response to such shocks, also with the support of development agencies. So we are joined today by James Lloyd, who is an independent consultant based in the UK, who is the lead author of this study. So before we start, thank you, James, sincerely for the outstanding work that you have done with the study. And I would also like to thank the DCED Business Environment Group and especially the task team within this working group, which consisted of the International Labour Organization, the World Bank, and GSZ, and who steered kind of the study process. We have a brief agenda for today. So James Lloyd will start by presenting the key findings of the study. I will give a very short reaction on the presentation afterwards, highlighting some key insights and implications from my point of view. And at the end, we're going to have a question and answer session. And of course, we encourage your active participation. Please also be aware that the study that we are presenting today is being published today. So it is online available, the full study as well, a short policy brief. So you will find the links to both these documents also today in the chat room of this webinar. So now I would like to hand over to James to present the key findings of the study.
Who has the answer to these questions? This was a response I heard in an interview to a subset of these research questions. This is important for business environment reform programming, as bilateral aid from some economies is shifting towards preparing for and responding to shocks. Answering these questions could justify programs that respond to political shifts in donor economies and the needs of low and middle income countries. Hi, I'm James Lloyd. I led the paper on building resilience resilience to exogenous shocks. This was a broad and complex area of study, and the paper focuses on the COVID-19 pandemic and 4 country case studies to answer the questions as much as possible, as was possible with the resources available. Today, I'm going to present the policy brief in relation to these 4 research questions. The report focused on preparedness and responses for the benefit of MSMEs, a often overlooked but particularly vulnerable segment. It answers the research questions in relation to the experiences of Brazil, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Malaysia. Thank you very much to the task team, consisting of colleagues from GIZ, the ILO, and the World Bank for their support in the delivery of the assignment. So to introduce the paper, stresses are the crises that the primitive exogenous shock places on a business ecosystem. These emanate from supply or demand-induced stresses, or both, either of which can lead to messy stresses. No country context is the same, no pattern of stresses is the same, and no business is the same. This requires a degree of experimentation in any response to an acute exogenous shock. The vulnerability of smaller firms originates from a complex set of often self-reinforcing reasons. The heterogeneity of MSMEs requires government support to be better tailored. Among these are informal businesses. Another criteria is the gender of entrepreneurs and workers. Exogenous shocks lay bare deep gender inequalities that are to the detriment of women entrepreneurs and workers. What determines macroeconomic resilience? The paper considers a resilience indicator. Under this, macroeconomic resilience comprises of 2 dimensions. Firstly, the capacity to withstand the immediate impact of an exogenous shock, including external financing needs and external solvency, and also the capacity to promptly respond in an effective way to the effect of an adverse exogenous shock, including fiscal balance as a ratio of GDP, government indebtedness, deviation of inflation from target, and institutional and regulatory quality. The case studies are all large economies with varying gross national income per capita, regulatory quality, and public finance positions. The countries, hence, have varying scores in this resilience indicator. Only Malaysia scored positively on the scale of -1 to 1. The adoption of effective countercyclical policies across LMICs is constrained by policy space. This constrains resilience. The debt position, particularly short-term external debt, has deteriorated in many LMICs. These positions are now out of balance with balance of payments positions and forecasted growth rates. There is a need for regulations to be more cognizant of the needs of MSMEs and for macroeconomic managers to be guardians of both economic stability and inclusive development. Across case study countries, progress to improve regulatory quality is slow, and worryingly, it seems to reverse between acute crises. There is a need to accelerate and maintain improvements in regulatory quality during normal business cycles. With exogenous shocks expected to increase in incidence and severity, concerted action must be taken to increase resilience. The principles of risk-informed development can help to shape this agenda. Which business reforms respond well to acute global shocks? There are a broad range of tools that are available to be deployed to acute global shocks. These cover monetary and fiscal policy and business environment reforms. In acute stresses, the challenge for policymakers is to rapidly diagnose the channel of stresses and identify the segments to focus on, be they priority sectors or value chains, or particularly vulnerable targets. While correlation between measures and impacts during the pandemic has been partly determined across LMICs, causation has not been determined. Monetary transfers and access to credit were found to be correlated with higher future expected sales growth. Causation was not determined. Wage subsidies, meanwhile, were negatively correlated with laying off workers, but did not affect expected future sales growth. Tax support, meanwhile, was found to be positively correlated with future expected sales growth, but does not influence the likelihood of falling into arrears, nor reducing the likelihood of insolvency. Payment deferrals of tax seems to be the least effective. But identifying effectiveness is challenging. The effectiveness of measures directly supporting MSMEs is driven by how they are relevant to the needs of MSMEs and how efficiently they are delivered. Business pulse surveys demonstrated that the demand for policy support differed across country income groups, firm size, formality status, exporting status, and transmission channel. Half of all surveyed businesses demanded access to finance and tax reduction and deferral measures. These tax measures were more in demand in low-income countries, but also less possible because of fiscal space. Monetary transfers, payment deferrals, and access to credit were in more demand in middle-income countries. There was found to be a particular mismatch between the needs of businesses and support provided in payment deferrals and access to credit. On to debt finance interventions. These were deployed in all case study countries. They were more in demand in middle-income countries where financial access is more prevalent. Malaysia deployed the greatest number of debt finance interventions, followed by Brazil. Ethiopia deployed one measure. Debt financing will be more effective where firms have ready access to finance. In Malaysia, for example, smaller firms use formal finance, short-term financing needs. Debt finance can allow for the self-selection of firms or behaviors with desirable characteristics, such as viability, if loans are appropriately assessed, and importantly, effective judgments can be made on future viability. Case study countries could have introduced debt finance interventions to respond to the recovery phase to stimulate innovation and investment, and Egypt has some success in this area in tourism. Rapid increase in interest rates, post-acute shocks because of pent-up demand, result in burdens to MSMEs, and guarantee schemes may deliver longer-term budgetary costs. During the pandemic, employment support measures were more in demand in middle-income countries than low-income countries. These can only be directed towards formal businesses with registered workers. Wage subsidies and training subsidies can be particularly effective during the recovery to tilt the incentives of firms towards restarting, rehiring, and retraining. Case study countries could have done more in this space. However, wage subsidies, if they're used in isolation, can encourage employment retention at the expense of the efficient reallocation of labour. During the COVID-19 pandemic, social safety nets were adapted to support informal workers. Effectiveness was challenged by the availability of finance to scale up support and the uniqueness of the stresses and the caseloads. Steps should be taken to enable the rapid adaptation and expansion of social safety nets. All case study countries deployed tax measures. Tax measures were particularly in demand in lower income countries, where access to finance is limited, but they were less likely to be deployed in these countries. Ethiopia deployed tax measures that were limited in scope, and they could not reach those unregistered for tax. The report talks about challenges in appropriately targeting tax measures. In some countries, only companies that made a profit could benefit from tax measures. No case study countries supported business entry, hibernation, or exit reforms during the pandemic. This is perhaps the most telling finding of the paper. These measures do provide opportunities for countries with limited monetary or fiscal policy space to enable business dynamism during shocks and further the process of structural change. In the initial stages of a shock, introducing extraordinary time-bound adjustments to insolvency frameworks can stop viable firms being pushed into bankruptcy. Designing and implementing regulations that allow MSME hibernation will also further resilience. This will require emergency legislation that can protect firms from debt payments, taxation, and other costs during an extraordinary event. Despite this opportunity, during the pandemic, regulatory flexibility in LMIC centered on trade-related regulations. This aimed to secure cross-border value chains and reduce demand and supply stresses. Levels of underinsurance in LMICs are staggering, and this hampers resilience. There are no examples of case study countries benefiting from natural disaster risk insurance. The World Bank and the UK are working on this through the Disaster Risk Financing and Insurance Programme and the Centre for Disaster Risk Protection, respectively, as are others. This is very important work, as only 7.5% of direct losses associated with 93 disasters were insured internationally. Which institutional conditions favour resilience? Responses by government show that formal rules can change very rapidly during exogenous shocks. While informal norms change more slowly in normal times, shocks do provide space for their rapid adaptation, perhaps to the benefit of MSMEs. Brazil, for example, was a late mover on movement control orders and support measures. Eventually, the government did respond, but only after significant economic and social costs had been borne. Egypt, on the other hand, responded rapidly and missed some of the worst economic and health costs of the pandemic. Governments and LMICs face very tough choices when economic crises eventuate. This challenge is often worsened by political divisions, insecurity, and social unrest. Particularly acute and severe shocks, governments can face unprecedented public pressure in rapidly responding, often with very limited resources. The perception of the ability of government to formulate and implement sound policies that permit and promote MSME development matters for building resilience. Only Malaysia shows gradual improvements in regulatory quality. Estimations for Brazil, Egypt, and Ethiopia all worsened between the global financial crisis and the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. They then improved slightly during the COVID-19 pandemic. This stop-start approach to regulatory quality hampers resilience. The risks of unequal state-business relations have been borne out in past crises. Across East Asia, strong business-government relations contributed to fast growth rates before the Asian financial crisis. But these relations then contributed to the crises. State-owned and strategic businesses are more likely to receive support, perhaps to the cost of MSMEs. Egypt's system for state-business relations has created influential state-owned enterprises, and state support has been channeled towards these. Smaller firms in Latin America have been challenged in concentrating their influence. Firms with fewer than 5 employees and informal firms were less aware of existing programs, less likely to apply for aid, and less likely to receive. In Ethiopia, government-industry relations differ within industries. These have influenced policy outcomes. But overall, there is a system of mutual suspicion that has been exacerbated by lack of dynamism in the associations and short-termism in the private sector. Even in Malaysia, which responded rapidly with large business support packages, the number of support packages announced and the frequency of their adaptation reduced policy and regulatory predictability, which particularly affected smaller businesses. Governments face challenges in coordinating their actions. However, case study countries relied on existing coordination mechanisms. In Nigeria, only 2 of 12 members of the new Presidential Response Committee to the pandemic were women. This is despite the gendered impacts of exogenous shocks. Inclusive public, private, and social dialogue can lift the profile of the needs of different segments of MSMEs. Across economies, there is opportunity for government to involve civil society, the private sector, and local actors in deliberations to increase transparency in decision-making, as well as the relevance, efficiency, and effectiveness of support. This is especially pressing when rapidly designing and deploying measures to support businesses during shocks. What data at firm and macro level can evidence resilience? Achieving consistency in theories for resilience is confounded by the heterogeneity of shocks and contexts. During the global financial crisis, concepts of fiscal and monetary policy space have risen in prominence. During this crisis, a resilience indicator was formulated that aimed to measure the effect of shock absorption and shock counteraction policies. This was updated in 2016 to account for the increasing relevance of environmental governance and increased exposure of the real sector to financial market instability, among others. Another composite indicator attempts to capture vulnerability to disasters and macro and microeconomic resilience. Microeconomic resilience was captured at the household level to account for welfare changes. Household level data could be replaced with data capturing the resilience of MSMEs. Innovations in the measurement of economic resilience continue, and innovation in upper income countries reduces the emphasis on fiscal and monetary policy space and increases emphasis on investment in research and development, contribution of services to GDP, and social progress, among others. These have relevance to LMICs, alongside fiscal and monetary policy space and regulatory quality. Information asymmetries between firms and policymakers during a shock are extremely pervasive. Brazil introduced an interesting program that was made permanent to share information between tax agencies, banks, and businesses registered in a public guarantee scheme. To measure resilience as an outcome and target support, it would be necessary to track firms over time. This will allow for the identification of firms and their characteristics that were able to recover from disruptions. International organizations have not yet embarked on a global effort to build a resilience index for businesses, although empirical work at the ILO has begun. The timeliness of data matters, as does the assessment of future viability. Despite the attraction of debt finance to policymakers, assessing solvency and viability is extremely challenging during a shock. This data is often not available, especially for smaller businesses, and shocks introduce, because of their nature, great uncertainty to forecasts. When considering data to target firms, authorities could consider utilizing, in declining order of capability requirements, solvency measures, where the discounted value of the business exceeds obligations to banks and government. Vulnerability. Declines in revenue have been used to identify vulnerable firms. This could be complemented with the notion of solvency. And probably the most simple is the segmentation of firms. As exporters, young firms and startups may experience acute financial distress, while being particularly important for the recovery. At minimum, these firms should be identified early and should not be excluded from support programs. So to conclude, much has been learned from the series of recent shocks, but there is a lot more to know. Some tools are more relevant to specific shocks and contexts, and efficiency can be improved. There is space to prepare to deploy business environment reforms, such as hibernation, entry and exit reforms, even in economies with limited fiscal space. There is also a need to sustain improvements in regulatory quality between shocks. Meanwhile, efforts should continue to improve measures to capture resilience at the economy and firm level. Once again, thank you to the task team for their support and for everyone participating in this webinar. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, James, for this very insightful presentation. I would like now to highlight some key highlights that I found particularly interesting in the report. And I would again encourage all the participants in the webinar to also write their questions or comments, but also probably personal experiences in various countries in the chat box, so that we can get more interactive discussion started later. So from my point of view, what I think is really crucial of the overall report is that there's a really urgent need for kind of a risk-informed development approach. So there must be some kind of integration of a risk assessment already in the policy making, which can help low and middle income countries not only deal with current crisis, but of course also being better prepared for a crisis in the future. The second key takeaway from my point of view is the role that micro, small, and medium enterprises play, and especially the role they play in low and middle income countries. They are often the backbone of the economy. So we must ensure that the support mechanisms and interventions that are taking place during crisis are properly targeted to address their specific challenges. And I think it's also important to note that one size fits all approaches won't work because they're businesses with very different challenges and barriers. For example, businesses run by women, businesses run by young people, businesses in the formal and the informal sector. So they have very different challenges. So I think any interventions have to reflect that kind of diversity.
Mm.
Um, Another very important point that I think cannot be um, overestimated is the important role of data and data availability, both at the macro, at the firm level. So I think it's very important to really have real-time, accurate insights into how businesses are doing during crisis, in order to direct resources on support where they are most needed. So in this way, any intervention measure can be evidence-based, targeted, and impactful.
Mhm.
And the fourth and last um, key takeaway that I want to highlight is the importance of the institutional capacity. So I think it became very clear that the institutional capacity is maybe just as important as the institutional resilience is just as important as the economic resilience. So there need to be stronger coordination mechanisms within the government, but also between government and the private sector. Um, and in general, we need to foster a more inclusive governance form, because if institutional systems are weak, the risk is very high that the most vulnerable businesses and populations are left behind. So I think it's very important to strengthen these systems so that any response during crisis can be more efficient, equitable, and accessible. So those are my four key takeaways. I don't know, Trumps, if you want to um, respond to this already.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, Tobias. Yeah, so some donors are pushing the notion of risk-informed development. I guess for policymakers in low and middle income countries who are really challenged to boost growth, there's many different things to think about. And I guess you've seen that. I mean, Ethiopia's pathway to vulnerability has been through trying to boost national development. So there's some kind of perceived friction between the two that I guess we need to kind of consider in our deliberations with low and middle income country governments. On data, I mean, this is an area that is constantly innovating, and I last made edits to the report back in November, so I'm sure there's been some changes already, but it's really positive to see the work of the ILO in particular in this space. I mean, one thing that I was caught by as I was drafting the report was we have the World Governance Indicators indicator on regulatory quality, but that's not specific to MSMEs. And so I wondered whether there could be scope to kind of consider, hiving off or adapting or refining that indicator to be relevant to the needs of particular segments of businesses that are kind of particularly within the lens of donor agencies, micro small enterprises, for example. Yeah, those are some immediate reflections, Tobias. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And we have now one questions in the chat box from Sixto Palacios, who's asking what kind of complementary tools do you recommend to implement the appropriate measures to overcome the limitations highlighted in the report?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Um, Complementary measures. I mean, the report makes a number of recommendations across the research studies, across the research questions. One is on preparing, getting the institutional frameworks right, getting the fiscal space appropriate, thinking about insurance, which is an emerging area of work, and disaster risk insurance, and I think that's really interesting avenue. and data. Yeah. And then when shocks occur, which inevitably they will, invest in supporting, I guess, the deployment of those tools, the effectiveness of inclusive public dialogue and formulation, for example, the deployment of insurance, etc. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done kind of before an exogenous shock eventuates. That's on the preparedness side, and then obviously during the impact of a shock itself.
And probably kind of a follow-up question from my side. Um, I mean, it's often the case that when there's no shock currently taking place, that this then designing policies with in mind with that there could come what kind of shock. Um, it's very difficult to with all the other aspects that you have to consider as well. Um, it's difficult to really have this as a priority. So I was wondering, what kind of policies would you say are kind of the low-hanging fruits that could be implemented the easiest way, or without
Sure.
yeah, pushing
Sure.
other aspects aside?
Yeah, this is the challenge, I guess, because spending so millions and millions of dollars on preparing for a shock that doesn't eventuate quite in the way, or doesn't eventuate at all. This is a question for policymakers. But there's some things that can be invested in and put in place that will be relevant to any type of shock. So the institutions side of things, for example, and that's relevant to normal business cycles as well. But it allows the response to be more effective. I guess this is one of the attractions also of insurance, because it doesn't look at the specificities of what the type of shock was, but it looks at the impacts, I guess, as well. So yeah, those are two areas that immediately spring to mind as areas that can be invested in. I think turning around this narrow, or the very small amount of maneuver in fiscal space in a short period of time, in many of the case study countries that we looked at, would be difficult. And I guess that's the attraction of insurance. And I was reading yesterday that one of the social safety nets, I think it was in Malawi, had an insurance payout because of a climate related event, and they received tens of millions of dollars to expand the safety net because of the impact of a shock.
Okay, thank you, James. So there's another question now in the chat from Griffin Kangiro, and he asked, "Isn't USA AID pull out from most low-income countries a shock?"
Yeah. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, it is. And there's several ways, I guess, that you can think about this. One is the immediate impact on balance of payments positions, because official inflows were very relevant to some countries, like Ethiopia, for example, which has been struggling with foreign exchange shortages for several years now, almost a decade. Official inflows were very important to the balance of payments position. It allowed for the funding of essential imports. So I guess that's one way that you could think about it. And another way is through the impact of the programs themselves. So yes, it is an exogenous shock. And some countries are responding. I know that Nigeria has taken money from the budget to cover up some of the public health expenditure that was now a gap. And today I heard from Minister Wong in Australia, and Australia is stepping up to the absence of USAID funding for tuberculosis in the Southwest Pacific, which obviously has important trans-boundary or trans-border implications. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, James. So just to make it clear, of course, you won't find anything about this USAID development in the report, because the report was developed last year. So we did not consider this kind of shock because, yeah, probably we did not expect this kind of shock. It was too early. It's too new, this development. So yeah, that's probably the reason why it's not addressed at all in the report.
Mhm.
So we have another question from Jochem Thijs. He asks, what could a resilience index, as it was mentioned, look like, and how could it be deployed? Does it make much sense if the context is so determining for the impact of an exogenous shock?
Yeah. This is a great question. And so several of the papers coming out of universities say that, resilience is inconsistently theorized and all the context is always different, each shock is different, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, I mean, the IMF conducts surveillance of public finance positions of low and middle income countries. So there is work going on that identifies at the macro level, I guess, the resilience of the global system, and our bank system is stress tested in the UK, and that happens in some low and middle income countries. So there is work going on. At the firm level, I mean, this is where less work has been done, and there's some work that captures resilience as a set of kind of capabilities rather than an outcome, and that's probably where it's more advanced. I think that work is progressing on this at the ILO in particular, and the report talks about the more detail about the methodologies that are being proposed. Having said that each stress is different and each case is different, I don't think that's necessarily an excuse not to do anything. One of the things the report tries to do is to develop a framework for shocks and stresses, because it's the stresses that matter, not necessarily the shocks. I mean, we can leave the shocks to one side because it's the stresses that really matter. And what policymakers need to be able to do, I guess, is to cut off the stress or respond to it if it's too late to that. And that's where data can be particularly helpful. Yeah, so data is the investment in data is continuing, but it's at the firm level that it's particularly needed, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And there's another question from Dadi Gelashe. Observation in the field. The disruption of physical facilities following COVID-19 contributed positively to the emergence of a digital ecosystem in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Is there scientific evidence in other countries supporting this observation?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, Daddy, very much for the question. We didn't look into, I guess, some of the outcomes from investments that were made during the pandemic, for example. I mean, there was a lot of resourcing that went into digitalization, for example, during the pandemic because of the nature of the crises, but also the development of the technology and the availability of mobile networks, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, one thing that the report highlights is that low and middle income countries themselves, at least the 4 country case studies, didn't do a great deal in terms of enabling investment and innovation during the recovery phase. So we talked in the presentation about subsidies for rehiring, retraining, debt equity for investment and innovation, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one space that could be progressed, I guess, within LMIC governments. Yeah, and I think actually the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development has a work stream on digitalization of business environment reforms. So I'd point you to the direction of that paper, thinking just about business environment reforms.
Thank you, James. There's another question from Dino Christian Siubotaro. So excuse everyone the way I pronounce your names. I try my best. So the question is, in the next 5 years, what do you believe may be the most likely economic shocks for developing countries, taking into account the current socioeconomic tendencies? And among these, which ones would have the greatest impact on social and political situation?
Could you Say the question again, Tobias. I didn't get the first bit.
Yeah. In the next 5 years,
Yeah.
what do you believe may be the most likely economic shocks for developing countries, taking into account the current socioeconomic tendencies? And
Mhm.
among these, which ones would have the greatest impact on the political and social situation?
Sure. That's a really interesting question. I mean, a lot is unknown. When I'm asked to do forecasts, I get a little bit sweaty. I'm under the collar. I mean, it's very important that policymakers in low and middle income countries are asking these questions. I mean, some areas are becoming more and more important, like cyber, for example, in how government works, and those systems are exceptionally vulnerable. We've seen it even in the UK with malicious attacks of NHS. This is our health service systems. And so, yeah, this is one area that I'm particularly interested in. Another, I guess, is obviously the climate-related extreme weather events and the work on disaster risk insurance is largely focused on that. And I guess that includes like the loss and damage contributions under the UN framework of climate change. So that's another. But I mean, we also need to be aware of the geopolitical context that we are operating in at the moment, and there is great uncertainty as to how local conflicts could evolve into regional or global conflicts. And this is something obviously to be aware of as well. So, the timeliness of this report is really, really important. I think it's become more important since we started work on it in January of last year, but the shape of the threats has changed and it will constantly evolve, which is why risk-informed development is important. Thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, thank you, James. I also think it's very difficult, of course, to predict which shocks will come next. But I think, as you said, there are so many uncertainties currently that it's important to prepare to different scenarios, which doesn't make the task much easier. But I think it's a wise thing to do to consider different kind of challenges and shocks. So we have a question from Gary McCarthy. He says the general reaction I get to USAID, Ukraine, etc., is that aid needed a reset on any event as poverty is rising in most developing countries. Also, any reset needs to be smart and catalytic. What would you both see as smart and catalytic for accelerating economic growth in developing countries?
Thank you, Gary, for your question. Maybe A did need a reset. I mean, it's always good to work, I guess, with your eyes wide open. My sense is that we obviously work in business environment reform. This is the focus of this webinar and the focus of the agencies that are kind of involved. So we're clearly going to go into the relevance of institutions, of good governance, of regulatory simplification, et cetera, et cetera. But development is a broad field. And one thing that I've been doing more and more of is thinking and working politically, localization. And this is important to me, but people come at this from very many different angles. Development is inherently political, and with that, then everyone has a different perspective, and power structures and dynamic, matter. So I'm not going to give you a definitive view, but we care in this webinar about business environment reform, and I believe institutions and localization are important. Tobias?
Yes, exactly, James. I think that's a very big question and yeah, probably the key question of everything we are doing. So it's yeah, we don't have enough time probably to discuss this in detail. So I hope Gary McCarthy can live with this answer. So, but the discussion certainly will continue. We have now a question from Emmanuel Liu. I wonder how positive peace framework propagated by the Institute for Economics and peace fits into this conversation?
Oh,
Personally, I'm not aware of this, but James, can you say something about this?
yeah. I wish I could answer the question with Tobias because I'm not aware of it either. But I guess reflecting on responses and the contents of the report and thinking about what positive peace might look like, it's about compromise and institutions, I guess, and we've highlighted already the importance of that in this webinar already. I'm sorry, I'm not able to provide a more succinct answer.
Okay, thank you, James. Um, then we have a question from Alex Mugova. He says, in my view, while the USAID funding withdrawal is considered a shock by many, it's actually going to have long-term positive impact. It's a wake-up call to those countries that have been contracting their health to the US.
Mm.
Perhaps this is the shock these countries needed to put their money where their mouth is. Do others agree?
That's an interesting point. I mean, after we heard the news from USAID, I did a trip to Nigeria, and I mentioned in the presentation that Nigeria had put some money into public health, I think on malaria programming, I think. And I was speaking to my Nigerian colleagues about it, and I tried to give that positive spin that I've just heard. And my colleague turned around to me and said, "But James, 75% of that money is going to be stolen." So I hope that positive things will come out of USAID closure. And I think that, maybe public direct funding of certain essential services did take away, I guess, or space, I guess, or accountability for the state. You could make that argument. We'll have to wait to see, I guess, what the outcome is. But it's good at least to see some responses, like I mentioned, from Nigeria, questions over efficiency and effectiveness, but Australia stepping up to the mark. This is important. We will wait to see.
Yeah, I think one thing that it can be seen, say the least, that the way it was done overnight certainly is not it's not the right way to do it, to say the least. So I'm checking the question and answer section and also the chat. Are there any more questions from your side or also observations, comments that you would like to share? Okay, I see in the question and answer box, global leaders, what measures can be taken to ensure that economic policies are inclusive and sustainable,
Mm.
addressing both environmental and socio-economic risks?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is, I think, something that perhaps um, donors haven't really considered. Is that some low middle income countries are like quite desperate to kind of catch up, and sometimes at the cost of environmental and socio-economic risks, perhaps. And so over the course of the webinar, we talked about the importance of regulatory quality and the importance of institutions for these kind of benefits around to mitigate environmental costs and protection, etc., and to deliver socio-economic risk. So I think there's this constant. This is one of the roles of donor agencies and public expenditure in low and middle income countries, and I don't think the need for that is going to go away. So particularly we talked about in this webinar about inclusive social dialogue, preparing for and responding to shocks, particularly when regulations have to be rapidly designed under significant pressure during exogenous shock.
Thank you, James. Mesfin Kebedereta is asking, did the research include agricultural MSMEs, which are often overlooked in addressing issues related to MSMEs? They are the ones that are primarily and severely impacted by natural shocks.
Sure. Thank you, Mesfin, for the question. Yeah, so we didn't go into individual sectors of the economy, such as agriculture, in a great deal of depth, partly because of the resources that are available, but also because of the data that's available on the effectiveness of responses. I understand that MSMEs in agriculture, generally in rural areas, obviously impacted by climate shocks. And we talked about the need to segment businesses, perhaps as the most simple targeting measure. Remember, there were three options. There was future viability, there was solvency around sales, and then there was the segmentation. So this would come in under that segmentation and ensure that agricultural MSMEs are not excluded from support. But also, even if on paper it's written in that this support package is open for agricultural MSMEs, that actually appropriate effort is made to communicate the availability of support and to tailor perhaps the mechanism to the particular needs of MSMEs in agriculture, who by their nature work in rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Jochen Theis is asking, can you elaborate on the concept of hibernation? Is it limited to the solvency of companies? What other instruments are there for MSMEs to bridge economic shocks that have proven to be most effective?
Sure. So hibernation was included under possible option under business environment reform, under, sorry, regulatory flexibility, which looked at business opening and business closure, but also perhaps a concept of hibernation. This is something that I think is quite innovative as a kind of a tool within the toolbox. So to protect businesses that enter into hibernation when certain parameters are met from certain costs, tax, debt payments, whatever it might be, for a set period of time. I mean, public responses to shocks are more justified, I guess, with an acute, very short-term shock. So with the pandemic, for example, we didn't know how long that was going to be. We didn't know how long it would take to get injections sorted out. But for some shocks, they're kind of shorter in nature. So in those cases, you know, entering into hibernation for 3-4 months could be an interesting way of reducing, I guess, some fixed costs and allowing survival of businesses for when the economy reopens, the demand comes back to kind of pre-crises levels. But in addition to that, we've discussed many other kind of regulatory options, from debt finance, employment support, wage subsidies. The report also talks about business costs, particularly on energy and energy price subsidies, which increased in use during the pandemic. Then in the report, you'll have a long list of regulatory tools covering macroprudential monetary policy as well, and their relevance to particular types of stresses. Yeah, so there's a broad menu, and we haven't covered the whole menu in this presentation, but it is included in the report. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So there are currently no more questions, and we only have a few minutes left. So probably the question to James, do you have anything else that you would like to point out at the end of the discussion that probably has not been mentioned yet?
Yeah, probably just to elaborate a little bit on the first point that I made. I mean, who has the answers to these questions? I mean, because each shock is different and each business is different, you know, we might not ever get the answers to all of these questions. So there's a degree of experimentation in response to any type of shock, which is why the institutions really, really matter. And this reversal of regulatory quality between shocks is a real concern, particularly for MSMEs. And so that was my guess, one of my key messages. And the other is that even when monetary and fiscal policy space is really limited, there are things that can be done around business entry, closure, hibernation, etc., to prepare, I guess, for business survivability during a shock. And that was all from me, Tobias.
Okay, so thank you so much, James, for your for the study and of course for the presentation today. Um, Once again, I want to point out the links to the full report and also the policy brief are in the webinar chat, but you will find these documents also published on the DCED website. I think it will be also published on LinkedIn and other channels. So yeah, take a look at these documents in detail. I recommend it. Yeah, then thank you all for your time and your active participation. And I hope the discussion has been insightful for you. Um, if you have any other questions or thoughts, please do not hesitate to contact us. We are happy to continue the conversation. And yeah, once again, thank you for joining us today. Um, this recording will be also made available soon. So if you have any colleague who was not able to join but would like to see the webinar, it's also will be available um, as a recording. And we look forward to seeing you again at future DCED webinars. Thank you very much.